see the number on the matchbook is old and faded.
Part 1. Jim Croce's Final Flight. Jim Croce was a legendary American singer-songwriter, remembered by audiences around the world for songs such as I Got a Name. But on September 20th, 1973, his extraordinary journey came to a sudden and heartbreaking end. That night, Croce had just finished a performance. He boarded a small chartered plane with members of his team, believing it would be nothing more than a short flight to his next destination. But what happened just minutes later? The plane took off under difficult weather conditions. Then, with almost no warning, disaster struck. The plane crashed. No one on board survived. Jim Croce was only 30 years old. How could a man who was finally beginning to reach the height of his career, after more than a decade of chasing his dream, be gone within minutes? And what exactly caused that fatal accident? The tragedy becomes even more heartbreaking when we think of the people Croce left behind, his wife Ingrid and their young son. A family that had struggled alongside him for years now had to face life without him. But perhaps the most haunting question is, why did Jim Croce have to die just as the world was beginning to discover him? What if Jim Croce had never boarded that fateful flight? How many more songs might he have written? How far could his career have gone? And could he have become one of the greatest singer-songwriters of his generation? Today, let us go back to the beginning and uncover the extraordinary story of Jim Croce, a man who spent more than a decade fighting for his dream, only to die just as that dream was beginning to become a reality. Part 2. The Philadelphia Boy and the Guitar That Changed His Life. Long before millions of people knew his name, Jim Croce was simply a young boy growing up in South Philadelphia. Born on January 10, 1943, Croce came from a close-knit Italian-American family. There was nothing about his childhood that suggested he would one day become a celebrated singer-songwriter. His father, James Albert, had come from Abruzzo, Italy, while his mother, Flora Mary, had Sicilian roots. Music was present around him, but becoming a professional musician was hardly the future his parents imagined for their son. As a child, Croce was exposed to many different sounds. He listened to everything from opera and jazz to rhythm and blues, rock and roll, blues, and folk music. Instead of following just one musical path, he absorbed pieces of all of them. Little by little, those influences began to shape something that would eventually become his own unmistakable style. Then came a gift that changed everything. His parents gave him a guitar. For Croce, it was more than just an instrument. It opened the door to a world that seemed to fit him better than anything else. He discovered the sounds of R&B, rock and roll, blues, and folk. And from that moment, music began to feel less like a hobby and more like a calling. But Croce did not immediately abandon everything else to chase his dream. After graduating from Malvern Preparatory School, he enrolled at Villanova University, where he studied psychology and German. He was the first member of his family to attend university, and his parents hoped that education would lead him toward a stable and respectable career. Yet something inside Croce kept pulling him toward music. While at Villanova, he worked as a disc jockey at the campus radio station, WKVU. He also became involved in the university's singing groups and began performing regularly. Croce was no longer simply a young man listening to music. He was becoming a performer himself. One experience during his college years would become especially important. Croce had long admired legendary blues musician Mississippi John Hurt. Then, almost unbelievably, he had the chance to meet and interview one of his musical heroes through his work at the campus radio station. The encounter became much more than a simple interview. Mississippi John Hurt agreed to record a jam session with the young Croce. For a man who was still trying to understand where his future belonged, that spontaneous musical experience was powerful. It reminded Croce of what he truly wanted. Could music really become his life? For Croce, the answer was becoming clearer. His talent was beginning to attract attention, and he was already proving that he could perform in front of audiences. He became a leader of the Villanova Singers, while another group he performed with, the Villanova Spires, also recorded music under the name the Coventry Lads. Then came another opportunity that most young musicians could only dream of. The Villanova group was selected for a foreign exchange tour, taking Croce across Africa, the Middle East, and Yugoslavia. Suddenly, the young man from Philadelphia was performing far from home and discovering the power of music to cross language and cultural barriers. Years later, that lesson would remain part of who he was. He had not yet become a star. He had not yet written the songs that would make his name famous. He was still just a young musician, searching for his path. But the signs were already there. The guitar had opened the door. College had given him a stage. And meeting Mississippi John Hurt had shown him just how powerful his dream could become. Jim Croce still had a long road ahead, and perhaps the most important chapter of his life was about to begin. The moment when music would bring him not only a career, but also the woman who would change his life forever. Part 3. Ingrid, the woman who changed Jim Croce's life. In 1963, Jim Croce was still a young musician searching for his place in the world. He had talent, ambition, and a growing love for music. But he had no idea that one ordinary day in Philadelphia would introduce him to the woman who would completely change the course of his life. Her name was Ingrid Jacobson. At the time, Croce was helping judge a music contest. Among the performers was Ingrid, a talented 16-year-old singer who immediately caught his attention. But their first encounter was anything but smooth. Croce approached her after she finished performing, apparently wanting to make an impression. Instead, he tripped over a microphone cord. And as if that were not awkward enough, he then stumbled over his words. He asked her whether she had ever considered singing rock and roll and told her that he thought she would be great. It was hardly the perfect introduction. But somehow, it worked. The two began dating soon afterward, and what had started as an awkward meeting quickly developed into something much deeper. Croce was drawn not only to Ingrid's singing, but to the connection they seemed to share. Before long, music became one of the central parts of their relationship. One evening, at a gathering hosted by one of Croce's friends, the couple experienced a moment that would reveal just how perfectly they fit together. Croce was performing alone when he invited Ingrid to join him on stage. Then they began to sing together. Something changed in the room. Their voices seemed to blend naturally, but the harmony was not only musical. There was also an undeniable intimacy between them. People around them could see that this was more than two singers performing a song. They were two young people falling deeply in love. Could this young woman become the person who would stand beside Croce for the rest of his life? For Croce, the answer seemed clear, but their relationship faced a serious obstacle. Croce came from a devout Italian Catholic family, while Ingrid was Jewish. Their religious backgrounds were different, and marriage would mean making a choice that could affect both their future and their families. Yet Croce was determined. In 1966, he converted to Judaism so that he and Ingrid could marry. It was a major personal decision, and it demonstrated just how seriously he viewed their relationship. His parents eventually accepted the marriage, even though they remained far less enthusiastic about his ambitions as a professional musician. For Croce, however, Ingrid was not simply the woman he loved. She became his partner, his musical companion, and one of the most important sources of encouragement in his difficult journey. The road ahead would not be easy. Croce wanted to become a successful musician, but success would not come quickly. There would be years of small performances, financial struggles, exhausting travel, and moments when giving up might have seemed like the sensible choice. And through many of those difficult years, Ingrid remained part of his story. Together, they performed folk songs. Together, they began writing their own material. Together, they tried to build a life around music, even when the industry offered them little certainty. Their relationship would eventually be tested by the realities of life on the road. But before the fame, before the hit records, and before the tragedy that would eventually shock America, there was simply Jim and Ingrid, two young people who had discovered that their voices sounded better together. Perhaps that is what makes their story so important. Because behind the famous singer was a husband who had found someone willing to believe in him before millions of listeners ever knew his name. And as Jim Croce prepared to chase his dream, Ingrid would become one of the people standing closest to him. But would love be enough to survive the brutal reality of trying to make it in the music business? That question would soon be tested in ways neither of them could have imagined. Part 4. 10 Years in the Shadows, When the Dream Nearly Died. Before Jim Croce became a familiar name on American radio, he spent years wondering whether his dream of becoming a successful musician would ever come true. After marrying Ingrid, the two began performing together. They sang folk songs, played small venues, and slowly built their lives around music. To them, becoming professional musicians seemed like a dream worth chasing. So in 1968, they made a bold decision. They left Pennsylvania and moved to New York City, hoping that the biggest music market in the country might finally give them the opportunity they had been waiting for. With the encouragement of producer Tommy West, they settled in the Bronx and began recording and performing as a musical duo. But New York was not the magical gateway they had imagined. Instead of instant success, Croce and Ingrid found themselves facing long hours, exhausting travel, and one small venue after another. They worked constantly to promote their music, often performing for audiences that barely knew who they were. According to Ingrid, they traveled an enormous distance during those years, logging more than 480,000 kilometers while playing gigs and building a following on the college concert circuit. It was a punishing schedule, and slowly, the dream that had brought them to New York began to threaten something even more important: their marriage. Life on the road meant endless travel, financial uncertainty, and almost no stability. The music business demanded everything they had, yet the rewards were nowhere near enough to justify the sacrifices. Eventually, Jim and Ingrid faced a painful question. Could they continue chasing music without destroying their life together? They had to choose. And in the end, they chose each other. The couple sold almost everything they owned, keeping only one guitar, and returned to the countryside of Pennsylvania. The dream of becoming a famous husband and wife musical duo seemed to be over. For Ingrid, stepping away from music brought some stability. For Jim, however, it was almost impossible to silence the music inside him. He needed to find a way to survive. So Croce took whatever work he could get. He performed at a small local club for only $25 a night. But that was nowhere near enough to support a family. He drove trucks, he worked in construction, he taught guitar, he took on whatever job was available. To the outside world, these might have looked like ordinary jobs, but something extraordinary was happening. Croce was turning everyday life into music. The people he met, the jobs he worked, the frustrations he experienced, and the strange characters he encountered all began finding their way into his songwriting. Songs such as Big Wheel and Working at the Car Wash Blues would later draw inspiration from the ordinary world he was living in. This was the irony of Jim Croce's struggle. The years when he seemed furthest away from becoming a star were actually helping him discover the voice that would eventually make him famous. He was no longer simply trying to write songs that sounded like other musicians. He was writing about real people, real jobs, real disappointments, real life. And perhaps that was exactly what his future audience would connect with. But during those difficult years, Croce had no guarantee that success would ever come. He had already spent nearly a decade chasing a dream that seemed to be slipping further away. How long could he keep going? How many times can a person fail before finally giving up? And what happens when the very struggles that seem to be destroying your dream are actually preparing you for the moment when that dream finally comes true? Jim Croce was about to find out. Because after years of silence, hardship, and obscurity, the songs he had written during his darkest days were finally about to reach the world. And when they did, everything would change. Part 5. Time in a Bottle. The song no one knew would become a farewell. By 1971, Jim Croce had spent years struggling to make a living from music. He had known disappointment, financial hardship, exhausting work, and the constant uncertainty of wondering whether his dream would ever become a reality. Then something happened that changed the way he looked at his life. Ingrid was pregnant. For Croce, becoming a father meant more than simply adding a new member to the family. It forced him to think about something that had always seemed impossible to control: time. How much time do we really have with the people we love? How many moments do we take for granted because we assume there will always be another tomorrow? And what if we could somehow stop time before the moments we treasure disappeared? Those thoughts became the emotional foundation for one of Jim Croce's most unforgettable songs. He wrote "Time in a Bottle" for Ingrid and their unborn child. At first, the song was simply a deeply personal expression of love. Croce was not trying to create a timeless classic. He was writing about the people closest to him, and about a feeling that was becoming more important as he prepared to become a father. He imagined what it would be like to hold on to time itself, to preserve precious moments and keep them from slipping away. The idea was simple, but the emotion behind it was enormous. Croce had spent so much of his life chasing a future that he had learned to appreciate the present in a very different way. He had worked ordinary jobs, he had traveled countless miles, he had struggled financially, he had seen his dreams almost collapse. Now he was looking at his wife and the child they were about to welcome into the world. Suddenly, success was not the only thing that mattered. There was love, there was family, and there was time. Yet no one could have known just how haunting the song would become. Because when Croce wrote "Time in a Bottle," he had no way of knowing that his own time would be so painfully short. Only 2 years later, on September 20, 1973, Jim Croce would die in a plane crash at the age of just 30. That is what makes the song so powerful today. Its meaning is no longer simply about a young husband thinking about his wife and unborn child. When listeners hear it knowing what happened to Croce, the song seems almost like a message sent forward through time. A man who desperately wanted more time would not get it. A father who wanted to watch his child grow up would never have that chance. A husband who wanted to build a future with the woman he loved would never see that future fully unfold. And perhaps that is why generations of listeners continue to connect so deeply with the song. The tragedy is not only that Jim Croce died young, it is that his life was just beginning to change. His career was finally moving forward. His family was growing. His songs were beginning to reach a much wider audience. Everything seemed to be opening up. And yet, time was already running out. After Croce's death, "Time in a Bottle" took on a completely different meaning for millions of listeners. It became one of the songs most closely associated with his legacy, forever connected to the idea of loving someone deeply while knowing that time can never be controlled. That may be the greatest tragedy of Jim Croce's story. He spent years fighting for a better life. He finally began to find success. He found love, became a father, and created music that touched millions. But he never got the one thing he wanted most: more time. And perhaps that is why, more than 50 years later, "Time in a Bottle" still feels so personal. Because Jim Croce did not simply sing about the value of time. In the end, his life became a reminder of just how precious it really is. Part 6. 10 Years of Waiting, 1 Year at the Top. For nearly a decade, Jim Croce had lived in the shadows. He had performed in small clubs, traveled endless miles, worked ordinary jobs, and watched other musicians achieve the success he had dreamed of. There were moments when it seemed as though the music business simply had no place for him. But then, almost suddenly, everything changed. Croce had been writing songs inspired by the people and experiences he encountered in everyday life. Eventually, one of his friends in New York received a collection of his new recordings and helped put those songs in front of the right people. This time, someone was listening. Croce signed with a major record label, and the years of rejection and uncertainty began to disappear almost overnight. In 1972, he released "You Don't Mess Around with Jim." The album introduced a much wider audience to his unique storytelling style. His songs were different from the polished pop hits dominating the radio. They sounded personal, vivid, and real. Croce could take a character from an ordinary neighborhood, give him a memorable name, a few flaws, and a larger-than-life personality, and suddenly that person felt like someone listeners had known for years. One song in particular changed everything. "Bad, Bad Leroy Brown." The song became one of Croce's biggest hits and helped transform him from a struggling musician into a nationally recognized star. Suddenly, The man who had once played for small crowds was hearing his own voice everywhere. And then came another major milestone. Croce began appearing on American television. He made his debut on American Bandstand, followed soon afterward by an appearance on The Tonight Show, and later performances on The Dick Cavett Show. The face that had once been known only to a small circle of music fans was now becoming familiar to audiences across the country. But Croce was not slowing down. His second major album, Life and Times, continued the momentum. His songs were climbing the charts, his records were selling, and his performances were attracting increasingly large audiences. Then there was I Got a Name. The song would become one of the defining titles of Croce's career, although he would never live long enough to see just how lasting its legacy would become. For the first time in his life, it seemed that everything he had worked for was happening at once. But success came with a price. Croce's record label had given him a substantial advance to help finance his albums and career. Yet, despite the growing money from concerts and royalties, much of what he earned went toward paying off debts and obligations connected to his career. So instead of stepping back and enjoying his success, Croce pushed himself even harder. He toured, and toured, and toured again. By 1973, he was performing more than 300 concerts a year. His growing fame carried him beyond the United States as well. That summer, he traveled to London and appeared on the British music program The Old Grey Whistle Test, promoting material from his upcoming album I Got a Name. To the outside world, Jim Croce seemed to have everything. The records were successful, the television appearances were multiplying, the crowds were growing. The dream he had chased for more than 10 years was finally becoming reality. But behind the applause was an exhausted man. More than 300 performances a year meant almost no time to rest, almost no time to stay home, and almost no time to simply enjoy being a husband and a father. Croce had finally reached the success he once believed would solve everything. Yet now he was discovering an uncomfortable truth. The closer he got to the top, the more expensive the climb became. And somewhere between the sold-out performances, television lights, long flights, and endless highways, Jim Croce was beginning to realize that fame could give him almost everything he had dreamed of, except more time with the people he loved. Part 7. When fame took away his time with his family. From the outside, Jim Croce seemed to be living the dream. His songs were climbing the charts, his face was appearing on television. Audiences across America were finally discovering the man who had spent more than a decade struggling to make a living from music. But success had another side, and that side was quietly taking something away from him: time. By 1973, Croce's schedule had become relentless. He was performing more than 300 concerts a year, traveling from city to city with barely enough time to rest between shows. His career was moving faster than ever, but his life at home was moving in the opposite direction. With every performance, another night passed without Ingrid. Another day passed without his young son. Another family moment disappeared into a suitcase, a hotel room, an airport, or a distant concert hall. And perhaps that was the cruelest irony of all. Jim Croce had spent years dreaming of success because he wanted to build a better life for the people he loved. He had worked construction, driven trucks, taught guitar, and performed in tiny clubs simply to keep going. Now the dream had finally come true. But was it costing him too much? As his fame grew, Croce was increasingly aware of the distance between himself and his family. The road demanded constant commitment. There were more concerts, more appearances, more travel, and more pressure to keep the momentum going. The world wanted more of Jim Croce. But Ingrid and their son needed something different. They needed Jim. That tension became one of the most painful contradictions of his final years. He had wanted to become successful so he could give his family a better future. Yet the more successful he became, the less time he had to actually live that future with them. And this raises a haunting question. What is the value of success if you are too busy to enjoy it with the people you love? Croce's story makes that question especially powerful because of what happened next. He was only 30 years old when his life was suddenly cut short. His son, Adrian James, was still a little boy. Croce would never see him grow older. He would never watch his first day of school, never hear about his dreams as a teenager, never sit across from him as an adult and tell him stories about the years when his father was still trying to become a singer, never know the man his little boy would eventually become. That is one of the details that continues to haunt people who remember Jim Croce today. In the comments from longtime listeners, many express the same feeling. They love Croce's music, but they cannot help wondering about everything he lost and everything his family lost because his life ended so suddenly. One listener simply wrote that it was heartbreaking that Croce never lived to see his child grow up. Others remember exactly where they were when they heard the news of his death. They were young. They were listening to the radio, and suddenly, the voice they had heard everywhere was gone. For them, Croce's death was not only the loss of a musician, it felt like the sudden disappearance of someone who had been part of their lives. Perhaps that is why his songs still carry such emotional weight. Because when people hear "Time in a Bottle," they do not just hear a beautiful melody. They hear a man who wanted more time with his wife, more time with his son, more time to write songs, more time to simply live. But time was the one thing he could never earn back. Jim Croce had spent more than a decade fighting to become successful. When success finally arrived, it moved so quickly that he barely had time to understand what was happening. And then, it was over. So perhaps the greatest tragedy is not simply that Jim Croce died young. It is that he finally reached the life he had dreamed about, and was given almost no time to enjoy it. That leaves us with one final question. If you spend your entire life chasing success, will you recognize the moment when you have finally achieved it? Or will the thing you sacrificed along the way turn out to be the one thing you can never get back? For Jim Croce, that thing was time, and he had so little of it left. Part 8. The Final Letter and a Legacy That Never Ends. On the night of September 20, 1973, Jim Croce had just finished another performance. He had spent years dreaming of nights like this, standing before an audience, hearing people sing along to his songs, and finally knowing that the struggle had been worth it. But instead of returning home to his wife Ingrid and his young son, Croce boarded a small chartered plane with members of his touring team. It was supposed to be another short flight. It became his last. Only moments after takeoff, the aircraft crashed under difficult weather conditions. Jim Croce was dead at just 30 years old. No one aboard the plane survived. For his fans, the news was almost impossible to believe. How could the voice they had been hearing everywhere suddenly be gone? How could a man whose career seemed to be just beginning already be finished? But the deepest pain was waiting for Ingrid. About a week after the crash, she received a letter Jim had written shortly before his final flight. The words were painfully ordinary, and that was what made them so haunting. Jim wrote about coming home. He told Ingrid that when he returned, everything would be different. He promised that they would have a life together, and, according to the letter, he was thinking seriously about stepping away from his newly discovered fame and leaving music behind. After spending so many years chasing success, perhaps Jim had finally realized what mattered most. Not the television appearances, not the applause, not the charts, but his family, his wife, his son, his future. And yet, he would never get the chance to live the life he had promised. There was another heartbreaking irony. On the day after the crash, Croce's record label released "I Got a Name." The song had been recorded before his death, but after the tragedy, listeners could no longer hear it in quite the same way. It became part of the final chapter of a career that had ended far too soon. And Jim Croce's story did not disappear with him. It continued through the memories of the people who had listened to him during their youth. Decades later, fans still remembered exactly where they were when they heard the news. Some were sitting in cars, some were listening to the radio at home, some were at school or working. One listener recalled hearing the announcement while traveling in a car with his mother. Another remembered being a teenager when the radio suddenly reported that Croce had died in a plane crash. For those people, Jim Croce's music became attached to a moment in their own lives. And more than 5 decades later, his songs are still being played. Time in a Bottle, Operator, I Got a Name, Photographs and Memories. Listeners still describe these songs as emotional, timeless, and deeply personal. Some say they still cannot hear Photographs and Memories without feeling a tear. Others say Time in a Bottle remains one of the greatest songs they have ever heard. Perhaps that is the strange power of Jim Croce's life. He spent more than 10 years trying to become successful. He finally reached the moment he had dreamed about. And then, just as the world was beginning to recognize his name, he was gone. But fame was never the only thing he left behind. He left stories, he left memories, he left songs that continue to speak to people who were not even born when he died. And perhaps most importantly, he left a reminder of something he understood better than most. Time cannot be saved. We cannot put it in a bottle. We cannot ask for more of it. We can only decide what to do with the time we have. Jim Croce had only 30 years to live, but his music has had more than half a century to remain with the people who hear it. And that may be the greatest legacy of all. Jim Croce had only 30 years to live, but his music has had more than half a century to stay alive in the hearts of those who still listen.